The days after Alex helped with the roof passed in a haze, but not the kind you forget. They were the kind of days where every glance felt weighted. Every small exchange was laced with something unspoken. I told myself nothing had happened. We hadn't kissed. We hadn't crossed any lines that could be proven. But in my mind, and somewhere deep in my chest, it was already too late. A door had been cracked open, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't close it. Daniel's absences became longer, his excuses shorter. He moved through the house like a shadow, carrying the faint scent of another woman's perfume, one I now recognized without question. I had stopped asking. Asking meant I cared enough to be hurt by the answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it anymore. One Tuesday evening, the truth I had been avoiding finally confronted me. Daniel had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he took a shower. I don't know what made me glance at the screen, maybe instinct, maybe desperation. An email thread was still open. Her name was Sophie. The subject line read, "Last night was perfect." I told myself not to. Click. I told myself I was above snooping, but my hand moved anyway. The words I saw weren't just casual flirting. They were intimate. Plans for future weekends together. Details of dinners, hotel rooms, and inside jokes I had never heard. The Sophie in his messages was getting the man I used to know, the one who laughed easily, who noticed little things, who made promises and kept them. My chest tightened, my hands trembled. And I closed the laptop so hard it made a sharp clack. I didn't cry, not then. Instead, I went out to the porch where the night air was cool and sharp against my skin. I needed to think, but all I could hear was the rush of my own heartbeat. That's when I saw Alex. He was standing in his yard, locking up his shed, the faint glow from the porch light catching on his hair. When he noticed me, he paused, then walked over, leaning against the fence that separated our yards. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I wanted to say no. I wanted to spill everything about the emails, about Sophie, about how I had been slowly unraveling for months. But instead, I shook my head and whispered, "I don't think so." He didn't push. Instead, he stepped closer, resting his hands lightly on the top of the fence. "Do you want to talk?" I hesitated only a second before nodding. Inside my tone. Inside my kitchen, I poured us both glasses of wine. He didn't sit across from me. Instead, he leaned against the counter beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I told him everything. Every suspicion I buried, every late night, every detail of the emails I had just read. The words came in bursts, sometimes stumbling, sometimes sharp. And Alex just listened. No judgment, no interruptions. When I finally stopped, the silence between us was thick. "You deserve better," he said softly. The simple truth of it made something inside me break. My eyes burned, and I turned my face away so he wouldn't see. But he did see, and that's when it happened. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering against my cheek. "You don't have to go through this alone," he murmured. I should have stepped back. I should have told him to leave. But instead, I leaned into that touch like I had been starving for it my entire life. His lips found mine in a slow, searching kiss, one that started gentle but deepened with every heartbeat. My hands tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer. The world outside that moment ceased to exist. It wasn't just physical. It was the way he kissed me, like he was trying to remind me of something I had forgotten how it felt to be wanted to be seen. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless. "This is wrong," I whispered. He nodded, his forehead resting against mine. "I know, but it doesn't feel wrong when I'm with you." I didn't have the strength to argue. That night blurred into something I can't quite put into words, a mix of vulnerability, heat, and the comfort of finally feeling alive again. But reality has a cruel way of showing up uninvited. The next morning, I woke to find Daniel in the kitchen, home earlier than usual. His eyes flicked from me to the faint red mark on my neck, then back to me. Something sharp passed over his face before he smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sleep well?" he asked casually, pouring himself coffee. I forced a nod. Yeah. He didn't mention the mark. He didn't accuse. But something told me he knew, or at least suspected. And strangely, he didn't seem angry. If anything, he seemed satisfied. That evening, I found out why. An email from Sophie popped up on Daniel's laptop again. This time, it wasn't to him, which was from him to her. In it, he wrote, "She's been distant lately. I think she's seeing someone. Makes it easier for me to walk away." The words hit me like ice water. He wasn't holding on to our marriage. He was already planning his exit, and my night with Alex had just given him the perfect excuse. When I told Alex, he didn't flinch. "Then let him walk," he said firmly. "You deserve a life that's more than waiting for someone who doesn't care if you're in it." But letting Daniel walk away wasn't that simple. There was the house, the finances, the years of history that had somehow turned from warmth to ash. And there was the small, guilty voice in my head reminding me that no matter what Daniel had done, I had crossed my own line too. The weeks that followed were a tangle of quiet encounters with Alex and increasingly cold silences with Daniel. One night, I told Alex, "I don't know if I'm ready to leave yet." He just looked at me for a long time before saying, "I'm not asking you to make a choice right now. But know this, I'll be here, no matter what you decide." That was the thing about Alex. He never pushed, never demanded. He just showed up in ways Daniel hadn't in years. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. Daniel came into the kitchen, dropped a manila envelope on the counter, and said, "I think we should make this official." Inside were divorce papers, already signed on his end. I stared at them for a long time, expected to feel devastation, grief, maybe even panic. But instead, I felt something closer to relief. I signed them that same day. Alex found me on the porch. That evening, the papers still sitting in an envelope beside me. I told him it was done. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down next to me and took my hand. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I don't know what the future will look like. I don't know if Alex and I will last, or if what we have is just the result of timing and circumstance. But I do know this. His unexpected help didn't just fix a gate or patch a roof. It pulled me out of a life where I was slowly disappearing. It reminded me that I was still here, that I still mattered, and in the end, that changed everything. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that makes you feel like time has slowed down just enough for you to notice every small sound, the creak of a floorboard, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant hum of a lawnmower. From somewhere down the street, Daniel had left early in the morning, muttering something about meeting a client and probably working late. I didn't question it anymore. Asking where he really was only seemed to create more distance. Still, I couldn't ignore the dull ache of loneliness that settled in my chest every time the door closed behind him. I was in the kitchen, halfway through making tea, when I heard a crash from the living room. I rushed in to find that the ceiling above the window had given way slightly, plaster had crumbled onto the floor, and water was dripping steadily onto the carpet. My stomach dropped. The rainstorm a few days ago must have done more damage than I thought. Panic set in. Daniel wasn't answering my calls, and I had no idea how to stop the leak before it ruined the flooring. I stood there, feeling ridiculous and helpless, until I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Alex was standing there, holding a folded tarp under one arm and a toolbox in the other. I saw the water coming down your siding from my place. He said, "You've got a leak. Let me take a look before it gets worse." I hesitated. Letting him in felt like crossing some unspoken line, but the steady drip of water behind me made the choice for me. "Okay," I said softly. "Come in." He stepped inside, bringing with him a faint scent of rain and cedar. Without waiting for instructions, he set his things down and inspected the ceiling, his brow furrowing. "You've got a bad patch in your roof. Could be from that last storm. I can patch it temporarily so it won't get worse until you can get it fixed properly." I followed him up into the attic, where the air was heavy and warm. Sunlight streamed weakly through the damaged spot in the roof, and water had already dampened the insulation. Alex knelt down, his movements efficient and sure. "You've done this before," I said, trying to distract myself from the close quarters. "A few hundred times," he replied with a small smile. "Part of the job. Besides, I hate seeing someone's home get damaged when I can stop it." Something about the way he said "someone's home" made me feel like he meant more than just the roof. We worked together for the next hour, him cutting and securing the tarp, me holding tools and occasionally handing him water. Our hands brushed more than once, and every time it sent a current through me, sharp and unexpected. At one point, he stopped to look at me. His gaze lingered, as if he wanted to ask something but wasn't sure if he should. "You seem tense," he finally said. I let out a humorless laugh. "Just things. Life. Your husband." The question was casual, but his eyes searched mine for an answer. I hesitated, then nodded. "We've been not great lately." It was the closest I'd come to admitting it out loud to anyone. He didn't push. Instead, he went back to work, his silence oddly comforting. By the time we finished, the leak was stopped, and the attic was quiet except for the sound of our breathing. When we climbed down, I offered him tea, partly out of politeness, partly because I didn't want him to leave just yet. We sat at the kitchen table, steam curling from our cups. "Thank you," I said. "Really? I don't know what I would have done without you." He shrugged lightly. "You'd be surprised what you can do when you have to. But I'm glad I could help." There was something in his tone, something that made my pulse quicken. It wasn't just gratitude in his eyes. It was a quiet, unspoken connection. The moment stretched, neither of us speaking, until the sound of my phone broke it. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. I answered, and his voice was rushed. "Hey, can't talk long. Just wanted to say I'll be staying overnight late. Meeting turned into an early one tomorrow. Don't wait up." The call lasted less than 30 seconds. When I hung up, I realized Alex had been watching me, his expression unreadable. "Work?" he asked. "Something like that," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. He nodded, but the slight tightening of his jaw told me he'd heard the detachment in my tone. "You deserve more than just something like that," he murmured. I didn't know what to say. No one had said anything like that to me in years, not in a way that felt genuine. After he left, I tried to distract myself with chores, but my mind kept drifting back to the attic, to the way his hands moved confidently, to the warmth in his eyes when he looked at me. It felt dangerous to think about him that way, but also inevitable. The next few days blurred together, but something between us had shifted. Whenever we saw each other, the conversations lasted a little longer. The smiles lingered. And then came the night that changed everything. It was Friday evening. Daniel had texted me that he'd be working late again. I was sitting on the porch, nursing a glass of wine, when Alex walked over. He had grease smudged on his shirt and a small cut on his hand. "What happened?" I asked, standing. "Caught my hand on some metal at work," he said. "It's nothing. But my truck's battery died on the way home, so I had to push it halfway down the street." I motioned for him to sit, grabbed the first aid kit, and knelt beside him. As I cleaned the cut, he winced slightly, but didn't pull away. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "Just common sense," I replied, but my hands were trembling. I was close enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw, the tiny scar just above his eyebrow, the way his eyes darkened when they met mine. When I finished bandaging his hand, neither of us moved away. His gaze dropped to my lips, and my breath caught for a heartbeat. The world went still. And I thought he might kiss me, but instead, he whispered, "You shouldn't have to do this alone." The words sank into me, heavier than they should have been. I wasn't sure if he meant fixing things around the house or holding my marriage together, or maybe both. We sat there for a long time after that, the air thick with unspoken things. When he finally stood to leave, he touched my hand briefly. It was a small gesture, but it burned in my memory for the rest of the night. I didn't realize it then, but his help with the roof had been more than a favor. It was the first step in him stepping into my life in a way that Daniel hadn't in years. And deep down, I knew that whatever this was between us, it wasn't going to stay innocent for long. I used to think I had my life in perfect order, at least on the surface. To the outside world, I was the woman who smiled politely, kept her home spotless, and greeted everyone in the neighborhood with a wave. Inside, though, I was balancing my life on threads so thin they could snap with the slightest tug. My husband, Daniel, and I had been married for 8 years. People often told me we looked picture perfect, the kind of couple you see in magazines, him in his pressed shirts and confident smile, me in my neatly styled hair and soft dresses. But those people never saw the silences at the dinner table, the arguments whispered behind closed doors, or the way he'd started coming home later and later, smelling faintly of perfume I didn't own. I didn't want to believe the worst. Denial can be comfortable, like a blanket you wrap around yourself on a cold night, even if you know it's too thin to keep you warm. So I told myself he was busy with work, that the faint scent of vanilla wasn't anything unusual, that the way he avoided my eyes some mornings was just stress. I wanted to believe we were still us, even though deep down, I could feel the distance growing like a crack in the foundation of our marriage. The house had grown quieter over the years. When we first moved into this neighborhood, we'd host small gatherings, barbecues in the backyard, wine on the porch, laughter drifting into the warm summer air. Those nights had disappeared. Now, most evenings were spent alone, me curled up on the couch with a book I barely read, pretending not to notice the empty space beside me. It was during one of these quiet spells that I first really noticed Alex. Alex lived next door, though lived wasn't quite the right word. He existed there, always busy, always coming and going. In his early 30s, he had that rugged, slightly unpolished look that made him stand out from the polished men in our neighborhood. His hair was often tousled, like he'd just run a hand through it a dozen times, his t-shirts a little faded, his jeans comfortably worn. I knew little about him, except that he'd moved in about 6 months ago, kept mostly to himself, and worked in construction. We'd exchanged casual hellos before, the kind neighbors give without expecting a conversation. But there was something about the way his eyes, deep brown with flecks of gold, seemed to notice more than people realized. Once, I caught him glancing over when I was watering my plants on the porch, his gaze lingering a moment too long before he looked away. The day everything began was one of those windy, overcast afternoons that made the whole neighborhood feel restless. I had just come home from the grocery store, juggling too many bags in my arms, when I noticed the loose hinge on my front gate had finally given out. The gate hung awkwardly, scraping the pavement, threatening to fall completely. I sighed, setting the bags down on the porch. Daniel had promised to fix it weeks ago, but like so many small promises lately, it had been forgotten. I bent down to examine it, already calculating how much it would cost to hire someone, when I heard a voice behind me. Need a hand." I turned, and there was Alex, leaning casually against the fence that separated our yards. He was holding a toolbox, as if fate had decided the timing should be just inconvenient enough for me to notice him. His smile was easy, but his eyes were sharp, studying me like he was trying to read the thoughts I wasn't saying out loud. Double quotes. "Oh no, I can manage," I stammered, though I had no real idea how to fix a gate. "You're going to manage with a broken hinge and no tools?" His lips curved in a faint smirk. "Let me help. Won't take more than 10 minutes." There was something disarming about the way he spoke, not pushy, just certain. Before I could protest again, he was already walking over, toolbox in hand. I should have felt uneasy, but instead there was a strange warmth in my chest, like I'd just been pulled into a different kind of moment than my life usually allowed. He knelt by the gate, his hands moving with practiced ease as he removed the damaged hinge and replaced it with a new one from his box. "You're pretty handy," I remarked, watching him work. He glanced up, catching my gaze. "Part of the job, but I don't mind, beats sitting inside." I hesitated before asking, "What do you do?" "Renovations, mostly. I like fixing things that people have given up on." The way he said it made my heart catch, though I couldn't explain. Why, in less than 10 minutes, the gate was swinging smoothly again. I thanked him, and he simply nodded, as if helping me was no big deal. But as he walked away, I noticed the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, one I couldn't stop thinking about for the rest of the day. That night, Nathaniel came home late again. I asked him how work was, and he mumbled something about meetings, his phone buzzing before he could even look at me. I watched him step into the hallway to take the call, speaking in a low voice I couldn't quite make out, and for the first time, I found my mind wandering not to where my husband might be when he wasn't here but to the neighbor who had fixed my gate without hesitation, who had looked at me like he saw more than just a woman holding her life, together with careful smiles. Over the next week, I noticed Alex more often. I'd catch glimpses of him working on his porch, hauling lumber from his truck, or leaning against his fence drinking coffee in the morning. Sometimes he'd nod when our eyes met. Sometimes he'd hold my gaze just a second too long, making me feel a flutter I hadn't felt in years. One morning, I was leaving for work when I saw him standing outside, talking to an older woman from across the street. He laughed at something she said, and I realized how rare it had been lately to see a man genuinely smile in my presence. The realization was bittersweet still. I didn't think much of it till a Thursday evening when the rain came in sudden, heavy sheets, the kind of rain that turns streets into rivers in minutes. I was sitting on my porch, watching the storm, when I saw Alex sprinting across his yard, trying to cover a stack of wood with a tarp. Without thinking, I called out, "Need an extra hand?" He looked up, rain dripping from his hair, and grinned. "I could use one." "Yeah." I ran over, barefoot and already soaked, and together we fought with the tarp against the wind, our hands brushing more than once. By the time we secured it, we were both breathless and laughing, standing far too close under the small shelter of his porch. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The rain was pounding around us, but it felt like we were standing inside a bubble of stillness. His eyes met mine, and something in his expression shifted like he was about to say something important before he looked away and cleared his throat. "Thanks for the help," he said, his voice lower now. "Anytime," I replied, though I wasn't sure what I really meant by that. I went home that night with my clothes clinging to me, my heart beating far too fast for what had just been a neighborly gesture. But deep down, I knew something had changed. I didn't understand it yet, but a line had been crossed. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something that would unravel the life I thought I knew.